Thank you, and thank you for coming, and welcome to what is called the Optimist Series. I wouldn't say this is an election that produces a lot of optimism, but we'll try to generate as much as we can in this context. This series is aimed at provoking fresh thought and thought-provoking conversations about the big issues that are shaping our world. So we're going to start, of course, with the big issue that's shaking the whole world. The entire world tuned in to watch the first debate. 84 million Americans. I work with some foreign television channels, and I can assure you people all over the Middle East and all over East Asia, China, were watching the first debate between Donald Trump and Hillary Clinton. It's really captured the attention of the world, as often, not always, but often our presidential elections do. A little bit of housekeeping. Each of today's two sessions, this will be the first, will feature a 25-minute conversation between our optimists, whom I'll introduce in just a moment, and we'll allow about 10 minutes for questions. You have, I believe, note cards at your places. About 15 minutes into each session, we're going to collect the cards, pass the question cards to the end of the aisle where members of the UCLA team can pick them up. Remember to keep a few blank cards because after the first conversation, there'll be a second conversation on a different subject, and we want to make sure you have cards for questions on both sessions. The topic for our session is A Nation at Crossroads. Does the campaign of 2016 change anything or everything? One of the things I've been looking at politics for quite a long time, as was indicated, since 1976. Some of my students think I was around during Millard Fillmore's administration. This campaign is interesting, it's unusual, it's the reversal of a long-term pattern in American politics. The old saying in Washington is, Democrats fall in love, Republicans fall in line. This time that was reversed. Democrats usually happen upon some new face, whether it was Bill Clinton or Jimmy Carter or Barack Obama, and they fall in love and swoon over the candidate and usually manage to get that candidate elected. This time, Republicans fell for Donald Trump, a new face who's never run before. Typically, Republicans nominate someone who's run before. McCain had run before, Reagan had run before, the first Bush had run before, Romney had run before. This time, Trump came out of nowhere, well, actually out of reality television, and staged what I call a hostile takeover of the Republican Party. It was the Republicans who seemed to have fallen in love. Democrats fell in line. Who was next in line for the Democratic nomination? Hillary Clinton. And she got the nomination after a bit of a tussle with Bernie Sanders. So the pattern has been reversed. Democrats have won the popular vote in 5 out of the last 6 presidential elections, all but 2004. They've carried more popular votes, including 2000, when Al Gore got 540,000 more votes than George W. Bush. The problem was he got them in the wrong places. He got them here in Los Angeles and he got them in New York City where he didn't need them. If a few hundred New Yorkers and Los Angelinos had moved to Florida temporarily and voted in that state, then we would have had a very different outcome and a very different president. The Democrats have become the party of the new America, Latinos, Asian Americans, gays who've become very prominent in politics. Interesting thing. In 2004, when we asked in our exit poll, are you gay, lesbian, or bisexual? It's an anonymous poll. 2% said yes. In 2012, 6% said yes. I don't think there's a sexual conversion going on in the country. But what is obviously happening is that gays, lesbians, bisexuals have become a force out of the closet, no longer in hiding, and they become a political force as well. Working women, single mothers, young people, educated professionals who never feel they have power, Jews, African Americans, and one group nobody talks about, the unchurched, people who have no affiliation with an organized religion. These are all part of the new Democratic coalition. The Republicans have suffered a hostile takeover. That's a business term. And they've suffered a hostile takeover by a resistance movement which has contempt for diversity and inclusion, the qualities that define the Democratic Party. If I want to think about who is supporting Donald Trump, it's nothing new in American politics. It's the people who are fans of conservative radio talk shows. and his language is very much that of a conservative radio talk show host. His typical attitude is defiance. He defies, conventional wisdom, the Republican Party establishment, conservatives, the press, common decency, the truth. He defies the Pope. Who defies the Pope? Well, a student once asked me here at UCLA in class, "Professor, is this the most divided we've ever been as a country?" And I said, "You know, young man, we did once have a civil war. That was a terrible episode, but I'd venture to say this is the most divided we've been since that terrible time." I'm going to introduce our two panelists now, and that's one of the questions that we want to get to when we go into the discussion. Lynn Vavreck, to my right, is a professor of political science, communication studies here at UCLA. She's also a contributing columnist to the New York Times, where I read and everyone in politics reads her columns assiduously. Her award-winning book, The Gamble, has been described as the definitive account of the 2012 election. She is probably one of the few astute observers of what's happening in an election. And we're delighted to have her on the panel today. And I'm going to start with Lynn and ask both of our panelists a simple question. We have the two least popular candidates ever nominated now, on record at least. We don't know back about Millard Fillmore, but we have the two least popular candidates on record nominated to run for president. How did that happen?
I think if we want to think about how we got to where we are today, two things are important. And I think the first thing is that these people were not always this unpopular. So right now, both Clinton and Trump are underwater, another business term, in terms of their favorability. They are more unfavorable than favorable. But both of them used to be more favorable than unfavorable. So if you go back to Hillary Clinton's time as Secretary of State, or even afterward when she came to UCLA and talked to us in 2014, she was more popular than unpopular. And the same is true of Donald Trump. In 2011, he flirted with running for president, and there are some polls from back then, and he's more popular than unpopular. So the first thing is that what happens during a campaign is candidates get less popular, because they're fighting with each other. The second important thing is to answer why that's happening. And that has to do with partisanship. And this is something that has changed over time. So if we want to think about why today we have the most unpopular candidates, part of that has to do with them, but part of it has to do with the fact that we have better sorted ourselves as a population into the parties. If you are liberal, you are now much more likely to call yourself a Democrat. And if you are conservative, you're much more likely to call yourself a Republican. And just like with your favorite football team, if you're a Bruin fan, you're not going to root for the Trojans. And if you're a Democrat, you're going to like Donald Trump a lot less when he starts beating up on your candidate than you did when he was just out there talking politics. So partisanship is responsible for a lot of this.
Okay. I'll put the same question to our second panelist, Matt Barreto, to my left. He's a professor of political science and Chicano studies here at UCLA. He's also the co-founder of the research firm Latino Decisions, which has been called the gold standard in Latino American polling. He's the author of 3 books and many articles on race and ethnicity in American politics. He's one of the leading experts in the country on Latino politics, and last year he was hired by the Clinton presidential campaign to direct their Latino polling and messaging and focus group research. So this is a subject he knows entirely. Matt, the same question to you. How did we end up with the two least popular candidates we've seen on record?
Well, thank you, Bill. Thanks for that nice introduction, and thanks to the Luskins, of course, and the university for hosting Lynn and I at this important talk. It's a real pleasure to be here. I'll start out by agreeing with a lot of what Lynn said, which is that a lot of this behavior would have been expected even if we had, let's say, Bernie Sanders and Marco Rubio. We still would have come to a point where both of those candidates were not popular with the American public because they would have been fighting, they would have been attacking each other. And so a lot of this is just the state of American politics today, that it's getting nastier, it's getting more divided. These team sports are becoming stronger. I also think that on the case of Trump, he has invited a lot of this upon himself. He has ratcheted up his rhetoric purposely during the primary through a strategy where he was attempting to get more news coverage and more exposure to his campaign. There were a lot of stories early on that he tasked his campaign manager or his associates. It's not clear if he ever had a campaign manager, but those people who surrounded him with just making sure he didn't lose, that he wanted to run and be respectable. And there were some memos or emails going around that said he just wanted to sort of be in third place, show that he had the chops to do this and raise his profile. By doing that, he started to have more and more sort of extreme rhetoric towards women, towards minorities, towards Muslims, towards the Democratic candidates themselves. So I'd say, in addition to what Lynn said, I'd say Trump really brought a lot of that on himself. If we go back and look at the 2011 or the 2012 Trump, when he was saying, similar outspoken things, but not quite as pointed. And so, he has to pay the price for that. A lot of people don't like the language that he has used, and that has driven down his numbers, in addition to the partisanship. Now he's obviously on the other side. In the case of Hillary Clinton, as Lynn said, she also had fairly high popularity numbers when she was Secretary of State, but has suffered probably a little bit through what has become just sort of an anti-politician year. You saw a lot of that discussion in the primaries with Trump and Carson and Carly Fiorina for a while, and then on the Democratic side with Bernie Sanders doing well, that a lot of people were just sort of tired of politicians. And I think regardless of what Secretary Clinton had done, there were going to be people who bought into that mood and felt that it was time for change. And so I would say, in spite of that, her numbers are rebounding and she's doing a little better. And we see folks like President Obama also finally above water in terms of his popularity. So I think that's going to be coming around, but a lot of this is to be expected because of the climate that we live in and the way that people make those decisions.
Let's talk a moment about the climate we live in. We have seen this year two populist insurgencies, one on the left with Bernie Sanders, one on the right with Donald Trump. What are the voters so angry about? Lynn?
Well, what's interesting about this question for people like me and Matt, who are really interested in digging deep to get the story straight, is that I have tried really hard to figure out what people are so angry about by going back in time to look for evidence of that anger before the candidates in 2016 started telling people they were angry. Okay, so this is why our jobs are hard, because once Donald Trump goes out there and tells his supporters, heck yeah, if you're one of my voters, you're angry, then in surveys, when researchers ask those voters, why are you voting for Donald Trump? They start saying, because I'm angry. I'm angry that jobs have gone. I'm angry about the economy and the global financial crisis, and my time hasn't come back. But what we have to do is we have to see those attitudes in existence before the candidates start to tell people that that's why they're for them. And we've looked really hard, and we cannot find evidence of that anger in the population before this campaign starts. And so if you go look at the Index of Consumer Sentiment, which asks people lots of questions about their attitudes about the economy, what you will find in 2014 is that most people feel as good about the state of the nation's economy as we felt on average in 1984, when Ronald Reagan was telling all of us, it's morning again in America. Okay, so it doesn't feel like morning in America. It feels like a 2 a.m. bar brawl. And there are lots of reasons we can talk about why that is. But this anger about the economy, in terms of attitudes, we can't find it in the data before the candidates start telling voters to feel that way.
I would just add on to that a little bit, if I may, Bill, that Trump definitely manufactured a lot of that anger with his supporters. But there were signs of discontent with some of the protest movements that we saw in the early part of the Obama years on both the left and the right. You had the sort of Occupy Wall Street folks. It didn't represent a huge swath of America, but those are some of the people in the Occupy Wall Street movement that eventually found their way into the Sanders campaign supporters. And on the other side, you had the Tea Party. And so there were some signs early on that there were people who were upset about not necessarily the economy, which seems to be what get some of the attention, but more in the case of that Tea Party movement, people who were upset about some of the changing demographics, what Obama represented. Remember, this is when that birther movement really took hold and started, and we remember some of those pictures from Tea Party movements of the signs that they were holding about the president. And so some of that was there. It wasn't being expressed nearly like it was being expressed on the campaign trail by Trump supporters and to some extent Sanders supporters. But you had those two movements, the Occupy Wall Street, a little bit more on the left, that Sanders tapped into. And I think the Tea Party really sort of laid the groundwork for what eventually became something that Trump could then reignite or remanufacture.
And I just want to add one little thing to that. I think it's really important for everybody to appreciate the subtlety of what Matt just said, which is that Donald Trump has not created these attitudes that you're seeing in the population now in terms of in-group, out-group attitudes about race and ethnicity. They were there. They were there. And they've been there for decades. He is just one of the first presidential candidates in a very long time to come and publicly, openly, explicitly push on that leverage point. So he isn't creating these attitudes. He's just making them bubble up more than previous candidates have.
Yeah, as I said earlier, we've seen Trumpism for a long time. All you have to do is listen to conservative radio talk shows. That audience has been around. They just have never taken a party nomination. Now, we're talking about some of the new and interesting features in this election. There are some things that are new. The gender gap is not new. It's huge this year, as you might expect, with the first woman nominee of a major party. But we're also seeing a new and larger gap, which I call the education gap. There's a gigantic difference now between voters who have a college degree and voters who do not have a college degree. This year, for the first time, white voters who are college educated may end up voting for the Democrat. They've never done that before, at least on record. Are we going to see lasting changes as a result of this election, Matt?
I think that it's starting to get to that way, and I'll say on a couple of fronts. One is white college-educated voters are definitely trending much more heavily Democratic in this election. I think because of a lot of the rhetoric and the policy positions that Mr. Trump has advocated don't sit well with people who have gone through a 4-year or postgraduate experience, been exposed to exchange of ideas and that openness and a more diverse environment. Those sorts of statements and the policy propositions that he has just don't sit well with those folks. And so if the Republican Party continues to nominate someone in the spirit of Mr. Trump, I think that gap will continue. The other place where I think we're starting to see permanent realignment is with minority voters. And so minority voters have historically supported the Democratic Party at large numbers, but not nearly at the rate at which they're supporting them this year. And as the electorate gets more and more diverse every year, it is important for the Republican Party not just to lose, that they can't lose any white voters, but they need to be making inroads with minority voters as they start to creep up to 50% of the electorate. So those two factors are really should be very troubling to the Republican Party. And you may remember that in 2012, after Governor Romney lost, Reince Priebus and the Republican Party issued a report. And they said, what are the things we need to work on? We need to do a better job of reaching out to women. We need to do a better job of reaching out to Latinos. And we need to do a better job of becoming more inclusive. And so that writing was already on the wall 4 years ago. And I think that the report that they'll issue this time around will be even stronger, focusing on suburban white women, college-educated whites, and minorities, or they'll be in trouble in 2020 and beyond.
Yeah. By the way, that report was very interesting. I was amused by the fact that when they issued that report after the 2012 election, they called it the autopsy report. Mm-hmm. My immediate reaction was, isn't an autopsy something you do when the patient is dead? Well, they may have yet another autopsy report. We don't know. Lynn, did you want to?
I just want to add 2 points very quickly to follow up on that. The trends among white men, I think, are part of a long-term movement that we've seen since 2004. And so college-educated white men have slowly been moving away from the Republican Party, and they're doing that more this year. College-educated white women, this is, I think, what's happening in this election. And I think what is so fascinating is that I thought the first woman nominee on a major party ticket, and that's going to be the reason that gender is going to play a role in this election. And what has actually happened is that Donald Trump has made this election about gender, and it would be happening if he were running against a man. He has primed gender in a way. College-educated white women are voting for Hillary Clinton 30 points more than they voted for Barack Obama in either one of his elections. That is not about Hillary Clinton. We know that because we didn't see that kind of thing in the Democratic primary. That's about Donald Trump. And is it an accident? People ask me, oh, well, do you think it's an accident that the first woman major party nominee is running against like the most chauvinist machismo guy who's ever... Yeah, I think that's an accident, and it's so remarkable. But he has made gender an issue, not her candidacy.
We're here as optimists. Well,
Sorry.
there was an instance not so long ago when Bill Clinton was speaking a few years ago, and the Tea Party was very active in 2010. And a woman complained that there's too much compromise going on. We shouldn't have to compromise. We should stand firm on our principles. That's what the Tea Party is all about. And President Clinton, former President Clinton, gave an interesting answer. He said, "Madam, read the Constitution. It might as well be called, let's make a deal." Well, the fact is, that's the only way our government works. And what now, the consequence of all this division is what looks like permanent gridlock. Perhaps you will differ with me on this, but I don't think the election of either Hillary Clinton or Donald Trump has a very strong likelihood of ending the gridlock in American government or in Washington. We've had 4 presidents in a row who promised to bring the country together, and all of them failed. The first President Bush was fired after 1 term. He promised to be kinder and gentler. Clinton was a new Democrat in the third way. He got impeached. President George W. Bush said, "I'm going to be a uniter, not a divider." He failed to do that. And Barack Obama made an impression in 2004 when he said, "There's no liberal America or conservative America, there's only the United States of America." They all failed, which means the problem isn't Obama or Clinton, the problem is the problem. What will it take to bring the country together and to make our government to work the way the Constitution requires it to work, which is through compromise, through conciliation? Matt?
Yeah, I think that at the heart of that is political leadership from both of the political parties. And that's what we lacked in some of the other efforts. And that's because the losing party is eyeing 4 years down the road for their chance, or perhaps only 2 years down the road in the midterm elections, for their chance to make a recovery. And so it's as though we're trying to ask 2 football teams to come together at halftime and work together in the second half when the team that's losing says, "No, we want to cream the other guy so that we can win." And you really need some level of political leadership to come out. And so in this case, if Secretary Clinton is victorious, as the forecasting models are projecting right now, Mr. Trump is going to need to stop sowing these seeds of discontent of election tampering or a rigged system and say, she won. She got more votes. She won. Now let's work together and try to bring the country together. So that's what you're going to need. I heard you chuckling because you probably don't think that's going to happen. But I think that's what's been missing in all the other cycles is that the out party has been looking 4 years down the road saying we're going to get them next time, and they already start putting together their opposition strategy literally the day of the inauguration. And so I hope that doesn't happen this time. I hope the parties are able to come together a little bit better, perhaps work together on some bipartisan legislation right out of the gates that doesn't look one-sided in a way that can instill that confidence.
And Lynn, what do you think it will take to unite the country?
Well, I agree with everything that Matt has said. And I think the interesting thing to think about in terms of political leadership is really a little bit theoretical. Like, what do you think it means for your representative to represent you? And when we send people to Congress, are we asking them to do what we all as citizens on average would want them to do? Or are we asking them to bring their judgment and experience and expertise to bear on the important questions of the day? If it's the latter, then we do want them in there bargaining and compromising with one another. That was obviously a lot easier historically when we had Southern Democrats who were quite conservative and we had some Northeastern Republicans who were quite liberal. There was more common ground to cross. We don't have that anymore. We haven't always had that as a country, so this is a replica of a time that we've seen in history previously. But if you think that representation means that our representatives should do what we want, then you do have people like Ted Cruz who are going to go and represent their districts and say, my citizens don't want me to compromise on this budget bill. And I'll draw a line in the sand and not cross it. And if I shut the government down, I'll shut it down because that is what my people want. And I think that's a really interesting theoretical question. What do you want your representatives to do? So I don't know the answer to this question, but I do think that you will be surprised if Hillary Clinton is president at how well she is able to do with Congress relative to Barack Obama. I think she will be a much more productive Congress conversationalist.
Very interesting. You both are very optimistic. I don't know what would happen if we had a Trump supporter here. There are some in the audience from whom we'll take questions. We'll go to your questions in just a few minutes. This is the most negative campaign. I've covered a whole lot of them. I was around during the 1960s. I remember the Goldwater ad, the Daisy ad, you remember? That was pretty nasty. But this, I think, is the most negative campaign in memory. Are we learning anything? Are there really any issues that are likely to be resolved by this campaign? Matt?
Well, at a start, I'll steal a little bit of Lynn's thunder because she often makes this point, and you went to me first, that the negative ads are not necessarily bad in terms of informing the public. We know from lots of research that people are still learning things, that there are still pieces of information, whether it's the statements the candidates make, the votes that they've held, the policies that they've supported or opposed. And so voters are still learning. And I think at the end of the day, the thing that we want is we want a more informed electorate. I think at the same time, the voters are telling us that they themselves are tired of the negative ads and the attacks and hearing really the insults that are coming this year. But it's very difficult to stop those when many of them are being driven by one of the candidates themselves. And so it's not just the ads, but the debates and the statements. And so, but they are informing the voters. I think we'll have a not so happy, but an informed electorate. I think when we look at exit polls and we look at other surveys, I think this year voters are paying attention. They tell us they think this is the most important election of their lifetime. We always say that, but voters actually feel that this year. And I think as a result, they are paying attention and they're learning something. And hopefully, they can use that higher levels of engagement and knowledge to transition and hold their representatives accountable.
Whenever we talk about negative campaigns, those of you who have studied American history will know that campaigns surrounding Thomas Jefferson and Andrew Jackson were not exactly kind and genteel. Right. The names they were called, the things that were said about Andrew Jackson's wife. I mean, this is nothing new. But we have something new in this election. I'm going to put this question to Lynn. Social media. Do you think this has changed and in many ways coarsened the tone of American politics and created a more negative campaign that we better get used to?
I think that there is something to be said for the way Donald Trump has used Twitter. And this is the modern press release. Back in the day when I was working on presidential campaigns, Matt is a lot younger than me. He's working on them now. But we had fax machines. And so if you wanted to send a press release, if you were in the press office, you were all day faxing. And you could really only do that once or twice a day because it took a long time to fax.
And maybe talking with your team before you sent the fax
yes,
out.
Yeah, exactly.
Not just...
So the vitriol and the rhetoric in this campaign has been tough. The ads are not as negative as they have been in past campaigns. That's mostly because we're only getting one side, really. 80% of the ads have been on behalf of Hillary Clinton. But the rhetoric is tough. And a lot of that is because the topic is tough. So we're having a conversation as a nation about a topic that we don't typically talk about. And so it's a tough topic, and Trump is speaking in a way that is vitriolic. But the other interesting thing is that he has raised as much money and spent as much money as John McCain in 2008. Now, if you remember 2008, John McCain took federal financing. Barack Obama didn't, McCain did. And Donald Trump could have taken the federal financing and been doing better off in terms of spending than he is now. People thought it was going to be a $2 billion election. It's not going to be, because he's not spending much, and as a consequence, she's not raising and spending as much as we expected. So everybody who wanted to get money out of politics and, we got to have an election where everybody pays attention and people are more, this is it. This is the election where money's not playing a role, the ads are more positive, but it still feels like that bar brawl. And I think a lot of that is that it's instant. Everybody can instantly get their reactions out, candidates, supporters, voters, in a way that previously was difficult.
Okay, we have just a few seconds, but I want to ask a quick question, and then we'll go to your questions. Quick question is this. What are the big issues in this campaign? Are there any issues? Or are they just calling each other names?
Well, the name calling has certainly become a big issue in the campaign. There's no question about that. And voters are actually aware of that and not happy with it. So that has somehow become one of the issues. But certainly there are other issues. I think at the top of that list are discussions about wages and getting ahead in America. The price of things seems to be getting away from a lot of middle-class families, and so that's something that we've been talking about, and we've been hearing voters talk a lot about what can be done, not just to create jobs, because unemployment is very low, it's at historic low levels, but what can be done to create better jobs and better wages and better opportunities for America. And then, of course, terrorism and international security have been issues, not only abroad, but here at home. And so those are issues that I think Americans are thinking about and assessing which of the two candidates is going to actually keep us safer or be able to address on the world stage these very, very important issues we're facing.
And Lynn, what do you think are the key issues that are being resolved?
I have to throw immigration in there and just race relations and how we will transition as a country into this different set of demographics. And I think part of the reason that this conversation is happening in this year is because this is the issue of our time right now, the way the Cold War was the issue of our time in the 50s and 60s. And so it's not going to be forever, but it's going to be for this cycle and maybe one or two more, that as a country we have to have this conversation about community and inclusiveness. And if it's more uncomfortable because of the way Donald Trump is doing it, but it was probably going to be had in some way over the next couple of cycles.
Let me just point to one discontinuity in this election. What we're seeing is an election with a lot of angry voters on the left, the Bernie Sanders people, on the right, the Donald Trump people, yet President Obama's approval ratings are going up. He's up to 55%, which is a lot higher. It's about where Ronald Reagan was when he was reelected. It's a very high approval rating. You would think Americans are deliriously happy, but at the same time, you're getting a very angry election. Which is more true?
Well, I think that Obama is doing well in some cases by contrast. And the state of the economy has been steadily improving throughout his second term, and I think it could always be better, but Americans recognize that. And so I will take the more optimistic side, that I think that some of the nastiness and the displeasure that we've seen expressed throughout the primary is not quite as deep as some may think. And so I think that there are some opportunities that if the economy continues to do well, to bring Americans together. That is always the big unifier, that if people's pocketbooks are doing better, they tend to be a lot happier.
I'm going to double down on optimism too. You have to if you're here, right? And just say that another interesting angle on this is that Barack Obama's approval level was below what we expected it to be, given the state of the economy, for the first couple of years of this term. And so for reasons that those two things are always related, state of the nation's economy and presidential approval rating. And Obama was taking a hit a little bit, and we think a little bit of that had to do with race, maybe a couple of other things in there. But this is kind of, I don't want to call it a mean reversion, but it's a reversion to where we would expect his numbers to be based on the state of the economy. So, it's these, you can tell lots of interesting stories if you stare at these things and squint. But part of what is great about this university is that it gives people like Matt and I a platform to dig a little deeper into what has happened historically and try to make sense of these numbers.
What we're going to do now is take questions that you've passed along from the audience, and they are being delivered to me right now. And I will read the questions and put them, I don't know if they're directed to a particular individual. Question 1, could the polls be wrong? Could we have a Brexit outcome? Lynn, you look at the polls all the time.
Yeah, sure. The trick about polling and the mistakes that you're all familiar with that you've seen in the recent couple of years is that it's become harder for pollsters to do two things: to actually reach people, get people to answer their phones, figure out how to reach people, when to reach them. So that's tough, that's a challenge. Lots of people in the polling industry are solving that in really interesting ways. The second thing is that it's become very important to construct the electorate right. So when you do get people to answer your poll, if you're lucky enough to get people to answer, then you have to say, who do I think is going to turn out in this election? And pollsters make really different decisions about that. My colleagues at the Upshot did a really interesting thing last week. They did a poll and they wrote about it, and then they took the data and they sent it to 4 highly respected, super high quality pollsters. And they said, interpret the data for us. And those 4 pollsters returned different results of what they thought that poll said. Okay, that doesn't mean polling is awful. It just means that the science that people bring to the craft is different based on the shop who's doing the work. And they all had legitimate reasons for doing what they did. Someone thought the electorate was going to be a little more Republican, some thought a little more Democrat. And so you get these differences. But yeah, if everybody's wrong about who's going to show up, the polls could be off, but the margin is pretty big. And so I think even if you're off, it's probably directionally in the right way.
I'll just say very, very quickly on that. That's why it's important to look at the average of the polls and not one individual poll. In 3 of the 4 polls, I think, that the Upshot reanalyzed, 3 of them had Secretary Clinton ahead. 1 of them either had Trump ahead by 1 or a tie, which is probably consistent with what some of the national estimates are, about a 75% probability, or 3 out of 4 that Clinton will win. And so we always encourage people and our students and others, don't look at one poll that favors you. Really do a good job of averaging them. And Nate Silver at 538 and Nate Cohn at the Upshot have both been sort of leaders in that, of reminding us to average the polls and see if 20 polls in North Carolina suggest that this is the outcome, that's probably the outcome.
Question, if the election were decided by popular vote, not by the states, that is the Electoral College, would the Republican Party ever win? Matt?
No.
Lynn?
I'm not going to disagree.
No disagree. Well, as I indicated, 5 out of the last 6 presidential elections, Democrats have outpolled the Republicans. The only exception was the presidential election right after 9/11, the 2004 presidential election, where the Republicans did have a very narrow majority in that one.
Can I put a small caveat on that? In 2004, not a caveat, just explanation, I guess. In 2004, which is the only election they won, where they had 50.7% of the popular vote and 286 electoral votes, the electorate was 77% white, and George W. Bush got about 40% of the Hispanic vote. In 2016, it's going to be about 70% white. So that's the group that Republicans are getting almost 92% of their votes from, whites. They're going to be 7 points lower. And they're also doing far, far worse with minorities. So in 2020, it'll probably be about 68 or 67% white. So that number is going to keep going down. And I think that's the reason that they have so much trouble in the future.
If you could change one thing in the political process, what would it be? Lynn?
Whoa. Gosh, do you have something that you might want to go first with? One thing?
I'd say the thing that we most often hear from voters is the issue of financing and access to the system. And so I think, there's a discussion about, possibility of continuing to making reforms on public financing and just ensuring that you don't have to be a billionaire to run for office and take money out of politics. The one thing that I would maybe personally change, and this is fairly controversial, is to perhaps endorse a proportional representation system like they have in many countries in Europe, and not have a winner-take-all, first-past-the-post system that we have, where that if you're in that 49%, let's just assume the Republicans don't win another presidential election again, they're still going to have 40-some% of the vote. Should they be shut out of all that sort of governing power? So I'm always a fan of giving people more representation, even if your party only represents 10% of the electorate. Maybe you should have 10% of the seats. I've always thought that was a good idea, in part because of my work on minority rights and minority representation. In city councils and school boards and state legislatures, minorities are often at the very bottom in terms of representation. So that's something I think that we could work on. I don't think will ever happen because the two parties in power would have to give up, but many countries across the world have a proportional system.
Lynn, you've worked in Washington, as I have. A question from the audience. What's going to happen in Congress? I suppose the easiest answer is nothing.
Yeah, no,
What
I
do you
think that is the easy answer. People often say, is Donald Trump going to be a footnote in history? And in 10 years, are we going to be thinking back on this and thinking it was like some Netflix show that we binge watched every day? And I kind of think so. I know, Bill, maybe you disagree with me a little bit, but I think that we go back to where we were with the Republicans in Congress, kind of split, Ted Cruz and everyone else, and Paul Ryan, you just don't envy Paul Ryan. He's got a tough road, and I don't see any of that changing. It's going to be, it's going to be 2013 all over again.
What do you think?
I think the big battle to watch is the one that Lynn just talked about, which is Ted Cruz versus Paul Ryan. These are both people who, assuming Secretary Clinton wins, will both want to challenge for the Republican nomination in 2020. And the question will be whether or not there's a more consensus-building approach. Does Ryan get something out of perhaps working with Clinton and passing some bills and bringing at least a Republican say into some of those bills? Will he get credit for that, or will he look weak to the sort of Ted Cruz and Freedom Caucus folks who don't want any compromise at all? And so I think that's a really interesting battle that will be looming in the Congress, assuming that the Republicans hold on to both the House and the Senate, which I think right now is at least the smartest bet. The Senate is obviously probably closer to 50-50, but it seems to be trending a little bit more safer for the Republicans lately. And so Cruz versus Ryan within the party, I think, is what I'll be watching for.
You might think about Mike Pence as being part of that equation as well, because there was a lot of admiration for Mike Pence after last Sunday's debate. Of course, the question with Mike Pence is, if Trump is defeated, will that taint Mike Pence's future in the Republican Party? Question from the audience, what effect will the populists on both sides have on legislative governing after the election, regardless of who wins? Will we be in for a new era of populism in the United States?
I don't think so. Do you?
I don't think so. I think they really ran strong, with the Tea Party and then Freedom Caucus. And I think Ryan is learning a lot of lessons at reining them in.
And I also think the Sanders side of this is interesting. Bernie Sanders has been in government a long time. He's not a legislative organizer. And so now that, he went and talked to the Clinton campaign about, I'm going to go to the convention and endorse and do all these great things, but I want to do X, Y, and Z in the, in Congress and blah, blah, blah. But he's not that guy. And so I think that it will be hard for him to take his supporters and that enthusiasm and turn that into some kind of legislative agenda, because it's just not what he's ever done in Congress. It's not the kind of member he is.
And the Progressive Caucus on the left has not nearly been as obstructionist or resolute as the Freedom Caucus on the right. They have sort of begrudgingly gone along with more centrist Democratic policies, and the Freedom Caucus on the right just hasn't. So
the other thing I would say about this is that I think both Trump supporters and Sanders supporters, there's nothing that I see that tells me those groups of citizens have formed a collective identity that will last beyond this election. And Matt, you've done a lot of work on this on the Tea Party, but like Occupy Wall Street, like those were groups that were important. But in terms of forming a collective identity that lasts, I don't know that that is there.
What do you think is the future role of a third party? A famous historian, Richard Hofstadter, once wrote, "Third parties are like bees. They sting and then they die." Matt, what do you think is the future role of a third party?
Well, this is a great question that goes back to one of the comments I made earlier about a proportional representation system. And that is that in our current system, whether it's national popular vote or electoral college, at least at the presidential level, it makes it extremely difficult for third parties to have a meaningful role or influence in the system. It doesn't mean that some people won't say that they're voting for them. I'm going to make a prediction now. I think that Gary Johnson and Jill Stein both are going to get far fewer votes on election day than we're seeing in the polls. I think a lot of people are expressing that frustration through a Johnson or Stein vote when a pollster calls them. But because that can't be transferred into anything meaningful on election day, I'm expecting a lot of those Johnson and Stein voters to probably come back and give one of their votes to either Trump or Clinton. And so that makes it really hard for third parties in America.
You agree?
We actually see this in the data that a lot of the people who right now say they're voting for one of the other candidates are the Sanders supporters. And so they're probably going to come home or stay home, but probably come home to Hillary Clinton. So yeah, I tend to agree with this.
Yeah. Sooner or later, people figure out that if you vote for a third party, you're helping to elect the candidate you like least, right? So it becomes irrational, but that doesn't occur to people until we're very close to Election Day. So that's a change we're likely to see.
Can I add one more thing on the third party, just quickly? One of the other things that fascinates me about what's happening is people, Democrats in particular, don't like Donald Trump very much. And they say, how do people believe all these things he's saying? Doesn't it matter to people that he says these things? And the first thing I'd say about that is he is paying a price for that. He's doing much less well than we think an average Republican should be doing in this election. So he is taking a hit for that. But what about all these things Gary Johnson has said, the gaffes, Aleppo, and can't think of a leader, and yet you don't hear people say, people are saying, oh, go vote for him, and nobody's really saying what's wrong with these Johnson people? Don't they care? And so this is just my plea to take your partisan lenses off every now and then, and just apply equal criteria across the board. Yeah, equal scrutiny.
Yeah, it makes sense to vote for a third party under two conditions: that the polls show the third party candidate has a real chance to win, or number two, if you honestly conclude that that Trump and Clinton are equally bad. If you think you really don't care which one of them gets elected, go ahead and vote for a third party. I want to thank our panelists for a very stimulating and interesting discussion. So we appreciate the participation of both Matt Barreto and Lynn Vavreck.